awesome economic outcomes we've already had, right? It's, I mean,
Is this Eric?
This is.
Eric, nice to see you in person, yeah.
Nice to see you. Wow, you weren't awake before.
No.
I worked on my tan.
Yeah.
Did you still, you're going to go?
You'll go first, you'll go second. I'll go. And
Did we lose our SunEdison?
yes. Yeah.
Tough, I know. I'm sure you all know folks in the solar industry. It's really,
Yeah.
Cylindra fallout. It's
right.
really hitting these guys because their business is almost entirely predicated on subsidy.
Yeah.
And so when it's like it'd be like being 16, your parents say, no more allowance for you. By the way, you have no time to get a job. And, you should go out more. And they kind of go, holy cow, I don't know how that's going to work.
Well, it was all of this focus on the utility side, solar projects was destined for what we're seeing because those are sustaining innovations, which means you're not going to have a big uptake level because it's kind of replacement level, and the consumer side of the meter stuff at some point has the prospect of actually having more activity. It's not there yet, but at least it meets the criteria of what could trigger disruptive growth. So in other words, there's massive overcapacity that was funded relative to what was going to ever
On the
happen.
supplier side, and frankly, you kind of, almost in some ways, you have to make a choice. We wrote so many fewer checks than some other companies. Certainly, China's the one everybody talks to, but you can look at the subsidies that the Spanish and the Germans and other countries put on these things. And we're not spending at that level. And yet you're not kind of bailing out. So we kind of got caught, in my opinion, a little bit in between. We haven't, feed-in tariffs can be a little bit favorable, but that's about it. It's like a discussion about it. A private company, you look at, hey, it's not a business I can go in it. And you say, hey, we only can spend $1 and the other guy spend 10. At some point you kind of go, well, maybe we should find a different thing to go. Yeah, we should go find a different thing to go do. And everybody's all caught up on this other thing, which was a big spend, $600 million Louay. That's $600 million the Chinese are going to give to their solar industry next quarter. So, in perspective, if you said, no, that's it. That's a part of it. Well, and they're conditioned to think that way. That the way these things get funded is the government writes the big check. Typically conditioned to think about it that way.
Most of their industry is on.
Right. So it's yep. Well, I just got back from India. We're spending a lot of time in a lot of different parts of the world. And India's actually a market that's got some really positive market things happening. But even there, and they're really trying to move to a more market-based approach in a way from the center. This is going to happen since 1955, I suppose, on some level. But it's even funny the dynamic there. Even with Reliance and Tata's and the big companies that are taking over a lot of the utilities there, their interest or ability to really step out and innovate on their own without the support of the banking and the government's a little soft, right? They're kind of looking for mom and dad to say it's okay, and they don't really want to step out of that box too far. And because it's right there, and it makes sense. And it's like, yeah, you're right. It sure feels better if. And so it's just interesting to see those dynamics. Whereas in some other markets, in certain places like Brazil, people are like, that ain't all with them. Let's just go.
Yeah. I guess we'll probably go ahead and get started. Y'all want us to go ahead and get started? Why don't we get started?
Ooh, it is better. Yeah. I think once you get started, it'll prompt people to.
Ding, ding, ding. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We are going to get started with consumer empowerment. So we have a great group this morning. The way we're going to structure it is we'll have 3 presentations, and then we'll take questions and have some questions of our own afterwards. So I'm going to start off with Kristin Zimmerman, who's joined us from General Motors. Kristin.
Okay, great. Give me a second here and I'll load my presentation. Notice I'm sliding. There we go. Good morning, everyone. And just to let you know, it's a thrill to be back here in Chicago. I've been spending quite a bit of time traveling back and forth between Detroit and Chicago and all across Illinois, working very closely with Commonwealth Edison. Dan Gable, I know, was out at the table there, and he brought his Volt, his Chevy Volt. It's out on the side of the building. So as a little bit of a canvas, and what I like to do before I begin my presentations is just take a look-see to ask how many individuals actually have driven a plug-in electric vehicle. Show of hands. Ah, good, good. Next question. How many of you actually own and drive a plug-in electric vehicle right now today? Okay, all right, that's what I thought. That's okay, just a few, but it is suggesting we're at the very early stages of this emerging market. That is extremely exciting. And what we will focus on in this session is what is it we can do to empower the consumer? What is it that's already been done? What is it that we're learning? And I'll speak specifically to Chevrolet and the Volt program. What are we learning from the consumers? And what does it suggest going forward, not only in the smart grid space, but in the consumer product space and in the education and outreach space that we can all learn from? Now notice I put a few illustrations on my cover slide, and it's to lead the witness. And one in particular that I want to speak to is right in the middle. This kind of plastic-looking thing, common coupler. It is indeed the common coupler to the vehicle for charging that vehicle. For levels 1, 120 volt charging, AC, and levels 2, 240 volt charging, AC. And it was established based on a collaborative effort managed by the Society of Automotive Engineers. Folks, this is critical to the consumer seeing a product that has no barriers, it's streamless. They buy a vehicle that is plug-in capable, and they all have that kind of plug and attachment to the product. Remember, with the evolution of the iPhone and a lot of the other smartphones, they all have different charging mechanisms. That in itself can be a little burdensome or a little bit of a barrier to adoption. So what we're really trying to focus on, and some of the things that I'll point out through each slide, is what are the elements of the product's immersion into the market and what we're learning that can really remove barriers, streamline innovation and the acceptance process of the consumer, and really accelerate us out of early adopter into a mainstream market. The other thing that I'd like to point to is in the upper left corner. It's showing a smartphone. It's actually an iPhone device. And I'll speak a little bit to the IT connectedness interface, but you'll hear specifically what we're doing in that space from my colleague Paul Pebbles from OnStar, who's in the audience, who will be speaking this afternoon. We'll really speak more to that platform. To the right of it, select battery charge mode, again for the customer. And we heard a lot about the role of the PUC and the role of smart integrated connectedness technologies through either Silver Spring or some of the other platforms. But this is a screen that's actually on the vehicle itself. So the consumer can plug in and charge immediately, They can delay their charging based on the departure time that they have. They want it charged by 6 a.m. Or they can add in to delay that charging based on your departure time and that favorable off-peak time of use rate made available from the local utility. These are things that empower the customer. They had no choice before. They had a vehicle that ran on petroleum alone. Now we have the opportunity, because of our interrelatedness and relationship with the local utility, managing that same customer and having them become a part of a solutions base that really informs the smart grid. I thought you might be interested to learn what we're doing with our national rollout. We started our shipment to commerce in December of last year, but we had our targeted markets, 7 markets, East Coast, West Coast, Austin, Texas. And in the East Coast, we really were looking at Washington, D.C., metro area, New York City, metro area. And then we launched in Michigan in March. Within a matter of a few months, the vehicle was showing up in 48 of 50 states. Why? Early adopters. Gotta have it. Hey, I waited in line for that first iPhone that came out. So we have people in the vehicle space doing the same thing. What does that tell us? I'll go on to describe a few of the elements in a few of my slides here. But this is the customer arena that we're dealing with. Now we're part of a national rollout. And it shows by the color code when we are selling retail to the retail customer in all the markets. And by November of this year, all of our Chevy dealers have been trained and identified. They all have their allocation of product. And they will be making available Chevy Volts to the retail market by November. You can order your vehicle today. Another thing to point out on this chart, and I'll also mention it in a follow-on chart, is model year 2011 production. There's a lot in the media about this. However, the blogosphere amongst the consumers had no problem with it. But the media spoke to limited production. Model year 2011 Volt, very limited production, by design. We did something radically different in the industry. We launched a retail product, a very advanced platform product, to the customer in that retail space first before we went into the fleet and commercial market. Typically, you learn from the fleet commercial launch, you bring those learnings into the next generation, into the retail space, and you go to work. We did the flip of that. And in doing so, we said we're going to limit our model year 11 production. We're going to learn as much as we can, and we'll ramp up model year 12, 60,000 units showing there, in response to demand, rather than pushing demand. So we think this model, it's showing that it works extremely well, but model year 1, less than 4,000 units, with a huge demand against that. This demand, again, we're trying to match with a ramp up to 60,000 units. That means 5,000 per month, folks. 45,000 of those units will stay in the US. The others will go global to some of the other markets that we're opening in the Volt space. For Illinois, this is what it looks like right now. I say retail availability now because you can order your vehicle now, taking delivery within weeks, not months, weeks. There are 141 Chevy certified dealers in the Illinois market, ramping up to 60,000 units, cost about $39,000, with a $7,500 tax credit. Again, an incentive to get some of these vehicles out of the early adopter space as quickly as possible into the mainstream market space. Deliveries occurring now. How could deliveries be occurring now when the market's not even open? As of 10/13, I tracked, and I'm only getting maybe 30% of what's really in the market. There are already 78 Volts delivered to Illinois customers. How can that be? The retail market, the dealerships, aren't even selling them yet in this market. Michigan market's open. East Coast markets are open. A a lot of one-way airline tickets, and they're driving the vehicle back home. It's happening already. Gotta have it kind of product. Very, very interesting dynamic in this space. And I counted about 50 model year 12 volts on order already in Illinois. Just think of what might happen when the market actually opens. Another informing piece in the smart grid space. Who is one of our key customers? I mentioned this interdependency, this relationship with the utility. It is indeed the utility. And I spend time in 21 markets, Midwest chunk and the East Coast, working specifically with the utilities on what this whole new load means to their system. What does it mean in terms of the customer relationship that they currently have? It means that their business, in large part, and I suspect there's some utilities in the audience here, the business model that they're operating under is going through a major transformation. Not only are we adding load to the system through the smart vehicle, but we have the capability to add that load in a very efficient conservation mode, as you heard earlier, manner. But we can only do that if the customer believes, that common customer believes, that there's something in it for them too. So this idea of incentivizing the customer, whether it be through time of use rates or some other dynamic pricing type of model that we can make available to the customer to suggest they are as much a part of the solution in this efficiency conservation space as we are by providing a smart product and as the utility is by delivering smart electricity, then it's going to work. They're a key stakeholder in this triumvirate. So what we've done, and it's worked extremely well, is to date, at least a month ahead of time, based on an opt-in survey that our Volt customers fill out when they place the order of their Volt, they can opt in, these customers can opt in to share their address, their home address, with their local utility. And in doing so, that allows me to send a data dump about every 2-3 weeks to the utility to say, this is where, of your customer base, these are the customers that are purchasing a Volt. Gives them, the utility, a half a heartbeat to know what modifications may need to be made at the local distribution level, and they start modeling and mapping. What does it mean to their business? It's been extremely effective, and it starts to help in the process of identifying where clusters will occur. Because we've all discussed, there's really no issue with generation. There's really no issue with transmission other than hopefully making it smarter and more informed. The key is really making stronger and smarter and more flexible the local distribution piece. So this early notification process that the GM team rolls out is really working well. I'm an engineer by training, but I love the marketing piece, so I'm going to share this slide with you and one or two others, because I find it very interesting. This is what we're seeing so far with our early Volt customers. I want to point out the lower right corner because it's kind of the summary of the slide. Predominantly male. That, to me, is counterintuitive. I would not have thought. It's predominantly male, 90%. Golly, I buy the vehicles in my household, but I found that very, very odd. College graduate, 80%. Advanced degree, 45%. Work full-time, 65%. Again, this is our early adopter market. We cannot live or thrive in the early adopter market alone, but these adopters are indeed creating the bow wave for suggesting this product's ready for prime time. It's ready for mainstream market. Yes, it's expensive, but as the market comes online, you drive down that cost, and I believe, this is a group that's really driving the PEV awareness across the markets today. But it has to live, sorry for the blur on this slide, it has to live kind of within this technology adoption curve kind of scenario. We're way at the lower end of it. And, you know, the fast followers, they create a nice bubble going forward. But as we get into the early majority, the lighter blue space, the influencers and these early adopters drive that growth. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it in the communication that's happening on the blogs. You know, we can't, our communication machine cannot be as savvy and as quick as what we're seeing so far with the blogosphere. The good, the bad, and the ugly, it's all out there. But it's a conversation that the customers are having. They're asking questions, and it's not just of Chevy. They're asking a lot of questions of their local utility. They're asking a lot of questions. Remember, they're savvy. They're well educated. They know about policy incentives. They know about regulation barriers. They don't want to see any of that. They want this to continue to grow. And they want to be the voice of the customer moving forward to build this early majority. And as we go into the early majority, indeed, your prices come down. I thought you might also be interested in who the customers are with respect to what did they own in terms of vehicle product before. Long story short, 86% of the Volt buyers replaced a non-GM vehicle. Chevy couldn't have dreamed that number. That's huge. Where were they coming from? Primarily Toyota Prius. And indeed, our early launch markets were identified, a key parameter that is, by where the Toyota Prius registrations were occurring. And the Toyota Prius drivers say, we're ready. We want to move out of a hybrid into an EV. Now, let me spend a little bit of time on that. Because there's a misconception out there that the Volt is a hybrid. It's because I'm an engineer, I want to point out the differences. The Volt's an electric vehicle, and it has an onboard gasoline generator. It operates just like a locomotive, but I would like to suggest that the design is quite a bit nicer than a locomotive. But that's how it operates. It must operate on electricity 100% of the time. It has an electric drive, primary electric drive motor, split half shafts coming into it, front-wheel drive. It does not have a transmission, folks. Hybrids do. And that onboard generator, it will create electricity for that drive motor after the battery is depleted. When the battery is depleted, it still has 30% state of charge. But then that generator comes on board, creates the electricity for the drive motor. The generator is not recharging the battery. You have to plug it in. That's an electric vehicle with a range extender. And the other reason I point this out is because I thought you might be interested in the genesis. Where did this vehicle come from? Why did we do an extended range electric vehicle? It happened, the evolution and the process happened back in the 06 timeframe. GM had just completed its energy strategy. Now remember, folks, this is pre-bankruptcy. In 06, a team of about 20 of us sat at the table and said, we need a vehicle platform that really represents this transformational energy strategy that we just wrote for the corporation. There was a gap, a serious gap. So we discussed, should we take hybrid? Should we develop something more than the bus and the two-mode hybrid that we're putting into our trucks into this more commercial or retail market? Said, nope. When you say hybrid, you think Toyota Prius. Can't go there. We'd be perceived as a slow follower. So we all sat down and watched Chris Payne's documentary, Who Killed the Electric Vehicle? We all looked at each other and said, that's it. Look what we did to our EV1 drivers, heaven forbid, but we still own that electric vehicle space. So how about we take it back? So the next question was, how do we get a conversation with our EV1 drivers to find out what the new vehicle platform has to look like? We invited them in and they said, hey, you're going to do it again? Fine. Put a range extender on it. Full stop. That's what we did. Yes, some new things needed to be engineered, but that's why, even in the hearts and minds of the EV1 drivers, it's an EV. It has to run on electricity. And in that, It is very enabling and empowering to the interdependent pieces of the supply chain and the utility sector to really leverage this new energy source that can come from just about anything that is electricity generation. We heard a lot about renewables. About 30%, I think, it's now ramping up, of our customers, our early adopter customers, either have solar on their home or are investing in solar on their home because they want to charge their vehicle from renewables. This just outlines for the volt the two power levels for plugging in, either level 1 above at 120 volt or level 2. The vehicle comes with a level 1 charge cord. Notice the common coupler. It's outlined on the bottom. It's J1772. We're spending a lot of time now with the SAE on looking at a standard. And it was mentioned earlier, standards and codes are so very important in enabling this market. But they're working on a common standard for DC off-board charging. There's no standard out there right now. But the SAE has come up with a coupler that takes that design and adds a little bit of a modification to the bottom. Remember, these are DC off-board chargers. They're getting up into 440, 660 volts. They're very fast, 20, 30-minute charge times for large battery packs on board vehicles. There's no standard. There is one particular product that is plugging in using DC fast charging, and that's the Nissan Leaf. It's been enabled to do that. It's made in Tokyo, folks, and the standard is coming out of Tokyo. It's called Chatamo. But it's not an international standard. So you'll see some migration in the market over time between what will be possible for the customer, because heaven forbid you don't want, one car has to use this, another vehicle has to use another. It's just not helpful. I spoke to this slide before. The key message is OnStar as a telematics platform is a very key enabler in informing, whether it be bidirectional communications, demand response, however you want to talk about it, a very key enabler for smart grid technologies going forward in the communications IT space. Okay, that's a very key point in this. And it's been exciting to watch how people use the OnStar component with the Volt. Whether it be from a smart app on the phone, as you can see here on the left-hand side, where you can communicate with the vehicle, if you want to being able to program that vehicle, that smart vehicle, to charge smartly. I have some lessons learned here, but rather than go through them one by one, let me just summarize here. Am I okay on time? Okay, good. No, I think because this is my last slide, so I'm going to wrap right up here. In terms of PEV readiness, plug-in electric vehicle readiness, what we've noticed to date, and I've been working in the market now for 2.5 years, and it's been a wonderful, evolving market as we've been growing, but coordination and cooperation, no one entity in the plug-in electric vehicle space can do it alone. We all are coupled in a good and empowering manner. And so we should take advantage of that and leverage that. And we've done so in a great deal by stakeholder and planning communications, sharing of best practices. And I'll point to an example of what we did in Michigan. And I heard, indeed, from the chairman of the PUC this morning, Illinois has been doing quite a bit of the same. A year and a half ago, the chairman of the Michigan Public Service Commission invited, let's say, a forum of stakeholders to sit down at the table, knowing full well the Chevy Volt was coming online the end of 2010. And there were utilities, there were the auto companies, there were the EVSE OEMs, sorry for all the acronyms, but the electric charging stations. And he looked at all of us, the chairman that is, and said, are there any barriers to the acceleration and the success of plug-in electric vehicles in our Michigan market? If there are, it's up to you, the key stakeholders, to identify them, remove them, and he would be our champion on this, and make sure that we're doing everything going forward to watch the market to identify these barriers and remove them going forward. That model, a bit top-down, though with a lot of bottom-up participation and cooperation, has worked really, really well. And the other PUCs, from the Midwest especially, and the East Coast, have been watching to see how that works. The bottom line is communication, cooperation amongst the stakeholders, such that the stakeholders can identify early on, this was mentioned earlier, the what's in it for me quotient. As you sit at the table, you learn of the context of the subject, you can determine what it means to your own business model. And from that point, you can determine your role. And we have found that to be extremely powerful in guiding and enabling the market going forward. Make it simple. There are so many complex models out there right now to suggest, oh, we got this new technology, we can add this in and we can learn so much more. But what really is it adding to the whole system? Time of use and dynamic pricing for the utility at first, at least a year ago, scared the living daylights out of them. Why? New billing systems. New billing systems mean what? Oh, that's a lot of money to revamp and redo. Installing charging stations. Well, if we do that and we give a time of use rate, then we have to install a second meter because we have to track that. We have to make sure it's a vehicle using that additional electricity rather than an appliance. Do you really need a second meter? Question mark. Not necessarily. Got a smart vehicle there or a smart EVSE or something else that can provide that. And the proverbial walk before you run. Again, in this space, whether it be an insurance company, a regulator, whomever it may be, oh, gas tax. Wow. How are we going to fund our transportation needs and the road maintenance needs? Because we've got too many of these vehicles in the market. Do we really have too many vehicles in the market? Not to say that eventually we might not have millions, and I hope we do. It's not there yet. Be careful what you ask for in that space, in the regulatory space that can be perceived as a barrier to really proliferating the customer's perception that the vehicle is ready for prime time. It's ready to go. There are no barriers, and the more that they can be the voice to the early majority going forward, the better. And I always like to show a picture of my car. Actually, I drove my Red Volt for 7 months, put 28,000 miles on it through the Detroit winters, and I drove it to Florida and to Chicago about 5 times, I think, and then the Upper Peninsula. And it was quite an amazing product. The more we drive it, the more we learn what it is all about, and that it is truly a disruptive technology to the market itself. Disruptive in the sense of the Clayton Christensen sense that it's a discontinuity. It's different enough to get people to ask what and why. And what that does in the consumer space is it starts the conversation. And the education and outreach around a new product, a new suggestive precursor to change in lifestyle, and how we use energy is a really good conversation to have right now. And through this product, I believe we have an enabler that really is a catalyst to that conversation. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
I might try to position this where it's a little bit more convenient. Because Eric, are you going to speak at the podium, or are you going to speak?
I'll wander around a little bit.
Okay, then let's make this a little bit easier.
But I can then tap.
Yeah.
I can tap my way through quickly.
That way, get as Kristin was trapped, and I will be too. And so Eric Dresselhuys with Silver Spring Networks. Eric.
Thanks. Is the presentation loaded? Do you know? We sent the presentations in. I don't know, it's not, we may need some IT help. Is it? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's on the desktop. Fantastic. We'll get there. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for taking the time today. It's unless it's lost on anybody else, this standardization around the plug is really huge. And I know that just kind of got settled up and done. And standards, we'll touch on a little bit, really are going to come into the whole conversation here around the consumer, because making this easy for the consumer is important. We're a networking and software company, so I always look at all the different plugs we have at home as middleware, right? Because the plug in the wall is standard, and everybody gets that. And what we've had to develop are all these other things to translate from that plug, which was really standard, into all the different things that this phone versus the BlackBerry versus the whatever do. My job on the panel here is to try to bring a little bit of a global perspective to things. Silver Spring operates on 5 continents, so we get a great opportunity to see how the smart grid is evolving and how consumers are engaging with the smart grid on a global basis. And I think just to level set, and this came up on the plenary sessions this morning, when we go off and talk to utilities, the regulators, and consumers, what we find is that there isn't one problem we're trying to solve. So we all strive for the simplicity that Kristin talked about, but the baseline is there's a lot of stuff going on. Some of those problems are very traditional in the industry: reliability, operational efficiency. In some parts of the world, non-technical loss, which is the nice way to say theft, is a big problem. People don't collect enough energy to invest in the grid to pay for all of this. And then recently, things like environmental regulation and this consumer engagement have come up, and as we look forward, some of the things that have been already talked about on the panel: renewable integration, new sources of demand like electric vehicles, and in some markets, we do work in Australia where they just passed the bill to monetize carbon. And so all carbon will have a price tag to it. And if you want to think about things that make a fundamental shift in how you think about energy, put a price on carbon and you'll find out. So all of these forces in total are causing people to rethink the entire value chain of electricity. And what that really leads to is a global mandate for the deployment of smart grids. And I bring this up because anybody in a specific geography might tend to think that, boy, are we off trying to do something that nobody else is doing here? Are we off trying to innovate in a space where it doesn't exist today? And I would tell you that the global mandate for smart grids is both far-reaching and gaining momentum. I won't read through all of the pieces up on the slide, but you can see some very specific cases like in the EU. The EU is an interesting example because the EU started out with a smart metering mandate that they very quickly expanded into a smart grid mandate. And the reason, if you happen to see the Financial Times of London yesterday, are pretty obvious. The predictions in the EU are that electricity prices and the check you'll write at the end of the month over the next 20 years is going to go up somewhere between 50 and 100%. And the difference between those two is what the mix of fuel coming in. And what's predicted also in the EU report is that the primary source of generation throughout all of the EU in 2030 will be wind. Not coal, not nuclear, not any fossil fuel. So as we think about the consumer and what's happening around the globe, is if the prices are going to go up, what are we going to do to mitigate those prices, get a little more runway out of the resources we have, and then empower consumers to make their own decisions about how and when they use electricity? Interesting other example I'll throw out is in Japan. And for folks that have followed the smart grid and energy efficiency space, Japan was never a market that was very interesting because frankly, they had a lot of generation. Demand response didn't seem like a big problem, and people liked all of their electronic toys in Japan, so nobody really focused on energy efficiency. After the events of March 11th of this year, it's a very different story. I had the chance to be in Tokyo back in August, and if you've been there before, you kind of do the before and after. It's a very different place. The temperature in the rooms is all about 75 degrees. The lights are all turned down to about half speed. And most importantly, I'd never been to a meeting in Japan in my life where everybody wasn't dressed in suit and tie. And they've got what they now call super cool attire for working in Japan, which is a nice way of saying just to help conserve energy, we'll take the ties off, we'll take the jackets off, and people were working in shirt sleeves. Big cultural impact when you don't have the electricity to meet your needs. So smart grid's a global mandate. It's happening in different ways and at different paces around the world. But I would tell you that there isn't a major region in the world that isn't aggressively moving forward to the development and deployment of smart grid technologies. Why are they doing it? Well, you probably know all the reasons, and these have been touched on throughout the conversation. But operational efficiencies, non-technical loss, consumer involvement, reliability. Folks here in Illinois are probably aware of the report that came out from Black and Veatch recently that talked about the total benefit for Illinois of smart meters. It wasn't even the full range of the smart grid, $2.3 billion of MPV benefit. What's interesting about that, and we'll get into the next couple of some specific examples from here in the Midwest, is that one of the challenges when you see those big numbers is that everybody realizes that the smart grid can deliver phenomenal benefits, but those benefits flow to a lot of different people. Some of the benefits in terms of operational efficiency flow back to the utility, and that helps to defray the cost of deploying the technologies. But a lot of the benefit streams flow to consumers. And so the utility implements the technology, but the benefit flows not to the utility, but to the consumers, and frankly, even to consumers who don't participate, because it lowers the costs for everybody. And then finally, of course, some of the benefits flow to the environment, and today in a business case in the utility world, we'd call those societal benefits or something because we don't have a price tag to them. But I can tell you in Australia now, that becomes a line item in a business case. So happening globally, happening for a lot of different reasons. Before you think this is something that only happens far, far away, I want to give some examples from close to home where smart grid technologies are being deployed broadly and at scale and delivering pretty fantastic results. So the first example I'll use is Oklahoma Gas and Electric, and Scott alluded to this in the plenary session this morning. But Oklahoma Gas and Electric's an interesting case. So just baseline, everybody here probably knows where Oklahoma is. It's that flat place down south. Net energy exporting state, right? So not a place where you would normally think that people have a big energy problem. Flat rate electricity, 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So what's the problem? Well, the problem was that OG&E was staring down building 2 gas-fired peaker plants that were going to operate for something less than 100 hours, probably close to 50 hours a year, at a cost of about $600 million, just to hit those incidental peaks on those hottest summer days throughout the plains. So they said, is that really the right way to go? Is that the right place to put our money? Or is there a better way, a more efficient way, to go meet our energy needs? And so that kicked off a program called, that OG&E calls their Smart Energy Together program, which consisted of the deployment of pretty comprehensive smart grid solutions, advanced metering, distribution automation, they have some renewable integration, but the piece I want to talk about here is the consumer empowerment. So the program, which was an opt-in program, allowed consumers to get a different pricing rate if they wanted to opt into the program. So a variable price structure, and there were a couple of different flavors. There's a flat rate with a critical peak pricing element, and then there's a more variable rate. And if they opted into that, they would be given tools, either programmable thermostats, a web portal, in-home displays, mobile apps, and then also were educated through a consumer outreach and education program. The results of the program have been pretty stunning. They get participation rates that are now pushing up against 20%. They've seen as much as 57% peak demand reduction with a more typical range between 11 and 33%. Now 11 to 33% is a pretty big range. So what's the difference between 11% and 33%? People saved 11%, even if they had no tools, they never logged onto the program. Just the awareness that energy prices were changing created 11% peak demand efficiency. As they started to engage through the web portals, through mobile apps, or took one piece of in-home technology, their peak demand reduction raised to 33%. 98% of the customers who opted into the program saved money. There's an interesting dynamic that comes up when you start to do consumer outreach. Some people look at this, they get more information. They never understood what a kilowatt hour was, but now that they understand what they pay and what they get, they go, wow, this is pretty cheap. I'll use more. So there's a small segment of the population that says, wow, I spend less money on electricity in my house than I spend on coffee at Starbucks. This is a pretty good value. I get a lot for what I spend, so I'll use more. But the vast majority of the people change their behavior and save money. And then the last piece, and I'll talk about this on the next slide as well, is we've learned a lot about consumer engagement. You have to get out to consumers. You have to educate them about what this is. If I had Kristin's job and I said, hey, tell me about a gallon of gasoline and what is that, that I'm going to replace? Most people would probably be able to describe what that gallon was. Volumetrically, they get pretty close. And they probably, within a few pennies, tell me what they pay per gallon. If I asked most people, probably even folks in this room, I would guess, but certainly the general public, what a kilowatt hour is and how much they pay and what they get for that, most people would be dumbfounded. So education about energy is a big part of what it takes to engage in these programs. It's not on the slide, but my favorite statistic off of OG&E's study is they have greater than 95% customer satisfaction with the program. So if you've heard the stories of smart meter backlashes and things like that, I would tell you that there are now models that you can follow to proactively and positively engage with consumers. And it was great to hear the chairman of the commission mention that in his talk as well. So 2 peaker plants avoided, happy customers. Maybe the last statistic that I would throw out, because we hear it all the time, and I know it's come up here in the state of Illinois, low-income households and elderly households participate at a greater level and save more money than any other group in the study. So this notion that there are people who cannot, or segments of the population that just won't, grandma won't get what a PCT does or how to program it, I would encourage you to go to OG&E's website. They've got videos. And my favorite one is of a grandmother who said, I save enough money a year to make 2 extra trips to see my grandkids. And that's making electricity mean something to a person. And that's what gets them motivated. Another example I'd throw out is AEP. If you don't know AEP, it's a big utility spread all across the country. But down in their project in Ohio, they're rolling out a very comprehensive smart grid program, both around grid reliability, which favors consumers, but then also web portals, demand response, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. But the piece I want to talk about here is consumer engagement. So what AEP's done a fantastic job of doing is getting out and using all of the modern tools that are available. So it's not just door hangers that, hey, we installed your smart meter today. It's getting out into the community. They've implemented, along with some help that we provided, a smart grid curriculum that goes to the grade schools and to the high schools and teaches people about energy and teaches the kids. Because I have a personal theory that all of us are too dumb to learn, but if we get to the kids, we got a shot. And if you look at recycling programs and seatbelt programs, I think that bears out. So conclusions, electricity is pretty critical to all of us, and smart grids become a global mandate. They're critical to ensuring the low-cost, reliable supply of electricity, which incidentally, if you go off and ask customers what they want, that's what they want. They just say, I want it to always be on, be nearly perfect, and cost next to nothing. So that's the thing we have to navigate. Communities around the world are building smart grids. They're doing it at scale today. The Oklahoma Gas and Electric projects, 750,000 consumers engaged. That's a lot of people. And it's empowering people to save money, not just in the crazy places. I live in California, the land of fruits and nuts. We're all kooky. I pay averagely 28 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity, so you'd imagine that I would be motivated to do this. But it happens where people pay 9 cents a kilowatt hour as well. And the last thing I point out, because I'm just hearing some of the other people talk, I was trying to come up with a thought around where does the center of attention, where does the center of gravity come on these smart grid projects? Because we've heard a lot of things today. We want to get involved in innovation. We want to create jobs. We want to build smart grid centers of excellence, as is happening here at IIT. So there are 3 conditions I would propose to you are critical if you want your town or your area to be a center of smart grid excellence. And I've worked this up this morning, so if it's not perfect, I apologize. But to make it memorable, the thing to remember is IIT, right? So the first thing you need are innovative projects. People come, and it's a perfect setup for the Pecan Street project, which is probably as innovative a project as there is in the world right now. People come where the projects are, where things are happening in the field. So if you don't have innovative projects going on, if the utilities and the commissioners and the other stakeholders don't get together and bring the projects to Illinois, it won't happen here, which means it takes investment. And that's both investments in actual projects in the field, but the kinds of investments that Mr. Galvin's made here in the project here, the investments that the vendor community are making for job training programs and worker training programs. And then the last piece is talent. What's fun about these projects is they are complicated. If you like simple problems that can be solved quickly, smart grid is not likely for you. These are fun, complicated, involved projects that take the smartest people we have. And it was mentioned on the earlier panel that what's great, I live in the Silicon Valley, and what's great is the people who come knocking on our door looking for a job say, you know what, I need a big problem to go solve. And the talent and drawing talent to the energy industry, the largest industry on earth, is the last big piece. So remember, as you're thinking about your checklist, IIT will bring the smart grid to you. Thanks.
Okay, first technical problem is on this little sucker. Okay, I'll pretend that this is my clicker. So what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is why the clean energy and smart grid economy is underperforming, because it is. Despite the fact there have been some very impressive advances in new technologies and products. I'll tell you what at Pecan Street, what we're doing about it, and why we're doing that, and really what our view of the roadmap is for a consumer-focused smart grid. We are headquartered at the University of Texas. We're a smart grid applied research consortium. The Galvin Initiative was an intellectual inspiration for our creation. A number of us who ended up creating the corporation that became the consortium Red Perfect Power back in 2008. And we owe a lot of gratitude to Bob Galvin, to Kurt Yeager, to John Kelly for what we're doing. It gave us the inspiration for what we're doing, and it actually gave us the cover to do what we're doing, because so much what we're doing right now in smart grid is important work focused on the utility side of the meter, but customers can be forgiven for rolling their eyes and saying, why do I care about that? And what the Galvin Initiative has done is said, what the customer cares matters. In fact, economies are typically built on serving the customer first. And so we're very grateful for their work and leadership. This is what we're doing in our work funded by the Department of Energy. So we have 11 member companies. We have a research team of about 50 people, not counting the researchers that are sent by the member companies. What we're going to do in our DOE-funded work is, first off, is starting next June, 102 electric vehicles from Chevrolet Volts will be provided. Customers will be buying or leasing them. This is the astonishing fact for all of you. The lease price for a Volt as of today is $3,000 down, $350 a month. And that got us to 150 people demanding access to one of the 100 Volts we're able to offer very quickly. They're really fast cars. This, we believe, will be the densest installation and concentration of residentially operated electric vehicles in the United States when it goes live next summer. We're going to be deploying home services systems, and what we say that this, we call it home energy management platforms, but what you're going to see is it better do more than manage energy if customers are going to care about it. And these will be deployed by some of the best consumer technology companies in the world: Sony, Intel, Best Buy with a company named Check-It, Whirlpool. That they'll be doing this in about 700 homes, all volunteer participants in Austin. About half of the homes are newer green-built homes. About half of the homes are older homes ranging in age from 20 to 80 years. Smart appliances provided by Whirlpool. LG Electronics is also a member of the consortium. We have work we'll be doing on air conditioning systems that LG will be working on, and we're working on some announcements of some other companies here shortly. Finally, in June of this year, in a 1/2 square mile area in this community behind you, there were 11 homes with solar PV. And then we set out working with the residents. We offered a small cash incentive. We offered a bigger one if they would do west-facing solar PV, because that wasn't done. Most homes that have PV, it's done south-facing. West-facing gets you more power generated during peak demand periods. As of today, we have over 190 homes in about a 1/2 square mile area when there were 11 homes back in June. You drive down, there are some streets in this community where every house has PV. 60% of the PV is west-facing. It's a remarkable change on this distribution system in a short amount of time. So why are we doing this? What is our theory that we are behind our work that chose us to take this path on creating opportunity and on the system architecture, the engineering and standards questions related to the smart grid? So first off, things change. It's a great photo of an early car passing a horse and buggy. There was a lot of hostility to cars when they first came out. You think about the market barriers that had to happen with cars. There were well-established channels to market for horses. Feedlots, hitching posts in front of most commercial buildings. People who needed transportation usually had a horse. So the car comes along, no fueling infrastructure to speak of. The roads were meant for horses, but not very good for cars. There were a lot of barriers that had to be overcome, but the car was such a fantastic product for what people needed that it overcame the hostility of legislatures who routinely did laws such as banning cars from operating if a horse was approaching. They had to pull over. Nobody topped Nebraska. Nebraska passed laws saying that if you had a car and you saw a horse approaching, you had to pull your car over to the side of the road, disassemble the car, scatter the pieces in the bushes, and hide in the bushes yourself. The auto industry is not located in Nebraska. It's in Michigan. And so we know that products can have a very revolutionary change in an amazingly short period of time. Culturally, things can change too. It's a favorite of mine. Winstones used to pimp Winston cigarettes on air. And I mean, some of you, like myself, are old enough to remember candy cigarettes. There are a lot of ways to prime the next generation of consumers, but one was to turn to trusted spokespeople to tell children that there were a trusted product for them, Winston cigarettes, because if you cannot trust Fred and Wilma Flintstone, who can you trust? We know that now, they might as well be peddling heroin on air. This is a profound cultural change that happened in a short period of time. In some ways, the change that made it where we don't smoke cigarettes and we never think to show children about cigarettes, and most of us don't smoke and you can't do it in a lot of public buildings. That change, in many ways, is more profound than the fact that we switched technologies or products on how we got around. So the question is, how does change come about? What are the triggers for these kinds of change, and can we be intentional about it? So I wrote this on a Mac, which means that all of the text is different size on Windows computers. But, yeah, so in other words, I'm not so retarded that I thought that was a good way for it to look. So why is the clean energy economy underperforming? Because it is, right? I mean, we spend a lot of money, and we're seeing a lot of bankrupt companies, and I mean, how many people really have products and services in their home they would call clean energy or smart grid products? A meter doesn't count. That's not your product. It's owned by a utility. I mean, it's a useful product for utilities, and I believe it will be ultimately useful for you as consumers. But unlike when the internet went through its downturn, or unlike when telecom went through its downturn, at the end of when those downturns began, many consumers owned products that had been personally impacted by those periods of ramp up in investment, and that hasn't happened yet. So what's going on? So first, if you want to create big economic growth, disruptive innovations are necessary to achieve significant growth. When we talk about disruptive innovations, and Kristin spoke to this, but innovation theory is the dominant, in fact, accepted economic theory on how big new markets are created. Its primary, the primary developer of innovation theory is a man named Clayton Christensen out of Harvard Business School, and this is the theory that is behind a lot of our work. Okay. Another reason why the clean energy economy is underperforming is, and this is the big one actually, the preconditions for disruptive innovation have yet to occur. We're not going through a downturn. We haven't gotten out of the starting gates yet. I think we will. I believe we will. Things like the Chevrolet Volt are unbelievable products, and they actually have a lot of the attributes of platforms for disruptive growth. But let's make no mistake. What's going on now is not a normal downturn after the beginning of a great new economy. It's that we haven't had the preconditions occur for big growth yet. Another reason why is that the new technologies have been overwhelmingly deployed by utilities. This is not a criticism of utilities. When new markets arise, they're almost always where the products are developed by companies that are outside of the industry. But we're going to show you why some of what this is happening is, in fact, really valuable and important. The utilities are providing deployments of products and services for. But incumbents, new markets are not created when the incumbents are the ones that provide the products, although they sometimes are the ones who have to let the preconditions. So to put this in perspective, in 1992, Time Warner and Silicon Graphics announced something called interactive TV. Remember that? You remember that? Yeah. What it was is you could point the TV, your remote control to the TV if you saw a product you liked, and it would take you to that product. You could buy it. See, this was made possible because the cable television industry had just gone nationally through digital upgrade to their networks. It was possible. Streaming video back in 1992. This is where we got digital cable, the ability to have 100 channels and nothing on. And yeah, but man, the picture quality was great. And so they had this incredible network, and they said, now we're going to upsell our customers in this network. And so Silicon Graphics and Time Warner said, one thing you're going to do, point at it, you can buy a product you see on TV. Another thing, you can read the newspaper on your TV, again, by pushing the remote and doing some things. Third, if you have another Time Warner customer, you're going to be able to communicate with them. Does any of this sound familiar? So this was all actually created, the brainchild of someone named Jim Clark, who was chairman of the board of Silicon Graphics. And so about 2 years into this multi-billion-dollar investment, Jim Clark left the board of Silicon Graphics. By this time, there was an arms race from the best companies in the United States and the world to win interactive TV with billions of dollars being invested. Microsoft got into the battle, Oracle, AT&T, other cable companies. There were billions of dollars being invested to win interactive TV and control the living room. Around this time, Jim Clark, now out of work, looking for something to do, learns about a guy named Mark Anderson out of the University of Illinois who had won the College Software Prize for a piece of software called Mosaic. And Jim Clark looked at it and goes, man, that looks like my interactive TV deal. And so he said, but isn't this thing called the internet? So he goes and hires Mark Anderson, and they start a company and incorporates it, and he names it Mosaic. But after a few months, Jim Clark changed the name of the company to Netscape. In 1994, Netscape was a startup company with about maybe 5 employees. And the way that they did it was over this thing called the internet, which nobody used except the military. And the way you did it was over a modem that did 2,400 bytes per second, compared to the streaming video digital cable networks of the nation's cable companies. If you would have looked in 1994 and said, who's going to win? This startup that sends data over 24 byte per second modems named Netscape, or Oracle, Microsoft, Time Warner, AT&T, Silicon Graphics, who would have won? And the answer was it was not even close. Netscape killed them. And innovation theory shows us why. It's because when disruptive innovations occur, there's a different pathway, and incumbents are not well positioned to do that. But the story does not end there, because what happened then is as the internet started off and became successful, at some point it had to have more robust data. At that point, broadband cable came over what? These digitally souped up grids that the nation's cable companies had created. So what happened in the internet ultimately is that the cable companies did not control the content. They lost that battle, but their investments on the grid made them the indispensable provider of the pipes. And now the idea of broadband internet, and in fact the very success of the internet itself, is inconceivable were it not for the important digital upgrades the nation's cable companies had made. This is a good pathway, if you haven't caught the metaphor going on here, for where smart grids opportunities can be. Finally, there's a problem with the way that companies are offering services, which is that they're ignoring innovation theory overwhelmingly. A lot of the companies that have gone bankrupt recently were doing it because they've ignored the way that new markets arise. So 3 ways technologies enter the marketplace under innovation theory: sustaining innovations. Those are within the existing market and delivery structure. Boeing 787, great Dreamliner, greatest airplane, passenger aircraft the world's ever seen. Flies further than 757s and 747s and 737s. The windows tint if the sunlight's coming up. The thing flies really well. It lands at the same runways. It parks at the same gates. The same airlines that buy 737s and 747s will buy 787s. In other words, its channel to market is through the existing market channels, and it's the same customers who previously bought other passenger aircraft are the ones who buy the 787. It's the sustaining innovation. Regulatory fiat is another way that products in the marketplace. Policy mandates. The government made me do it, or the insurance company made me do it. Most famous example, smoke alarms. Didn't exist as a product until they were required by building codes, insurance companies, and governments at different levels. Corn ethanol is an unhappy current example. Disruptive innovations, new customers or consumption occasions. Transistor radios, mobile phones, photocopiers. Transistor radio. So anybody know where the transistor in its modern incarnation came from? Bell Labs. It actually been invented, it turns out of Germany in like the 20s. But the transistor, as we know it, was created in Bell Labs in the 50s, I think it was. Immediately, there was a wide recognition of what the potential of the transistor was. And the world's best television companies said, we got to try to figure out how to do this. But the problem is that it would be kind of like taking a 286 processor and trying to run Office 2011 at the same time you're running streaming video, and the problem was that, just like, the early processors and computers, which were successors to the transistor, they were not able to have the horsepower to run TVs. So Sony had an insight. Sony was basically a startup back then. And they said their idea was, okay, let's take the transistor, which is underpowered, and let's put it into a crummy little radio, and let's market it to teenagers. So why is that big of an insight? My 7-year-old son is hammering me to get the new iPod Touch when he had the last one. Well, it turns out in the 50s that just like TVs, radios also sat on the floor of your living room. They had vacuum tubes. So that meant that teenagers didn't buy radios. And if they wanted to listen to Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Little Richard, where they had to do it? In their living room. Next to who? Their parents. This is a rotten deal. So suddenly Sony comes along and says, hey, this radio may not be so great, but you can listen to what you want to listen to anywhere you want to listen to it, and your parents don't have to be around. They couldn't make enough of them. It was a sensation. And it opened up music industry. It opened up radio stations that were targeted specifically to teenagers. Why? Because they suddenly had a radio they could listen to those radio stations on. So what this said, then Sony took the transistor and made it better and made it a black and white TVs, and over time made it into a TV that was worthy of competing with RCA and Victor and Zenith. And at that point, it was a better TV, and it was cheaper, better picture, smaller profile. And the incumbent TV companies goes, oh man, we've got to get ourselves a transistor TV. The problem was Sony had been doing this for a decade. And these guys were just trying to learn it at the time, and it was over. So that is an example, taking a new technology, don't try to make it do something it can't do of competing with the incumbents. Target it at solving problems for customers. Take that technology, what it's good at today, and solve a new group of customers' challenges. Economic growth potentials, this gets to the heart of why this is all underperforming. Sustaining innovations, moderate or incremental. Boeing is going to make a nice amount of revenue off the 787. Is it going to trigger a revolution in air traffic sales? No. I mean, is it going to make it where we all buy Boeing 787s? No, it'll still be the airlines. In other words, it'll be good for Boeing, but it is not going to trigger an overall economic revolution in the same way that the iPhone or the Model T4 did. Regulatory fiat, moderate or negative. Corn-based ethanol, great if you're a corn farmer, bad if you eat corn, and not so good if you use gasoline. Smoke alarms, you have to buy them, so it costs you money. Your house doesn't burn down, score, Disruptive innovations, significant. This is where new markets arise. So we're going to skip through some of this stuff because we want to make sure we get to so let's talk about two things. Disruptive innovations, platform characteristics. First off, disruptive innovations need a new platform. And it has to do more than one thing. So, built on other platforms, capable of more than one use. So if someone says, hey, I've got a platform for energy management, your answer is energy management and what else? It needs to be able to do something more than energy management. Empower customers to do job in a new context. Teenagers able to listen to music in a new location, in other words, not next to their parents in the living room. By the way, powering your car not at a gas station, but in your garage at night. If you're a mom of 3 kids in Austin, Texas, on a 105-degree summer afternoon, we had 90 of these days this summer, and you want to go fill up your car, you got to do it when your kids are awake, all right? Which means you got to do it when it's 105 degrees outside. You got to go to the gas station. When you go to the gas station, what's the first thing you have to do when you pull up the gas pump? Turn off your car with your 3 kids and it's 105 degrees outside. This is not a happy moment. And so, or you can plug in your car at night while you're reading your kids' bedtime stories and feeding them, giving them baths. And you wake up in the morning, your car is good to go. It's awesome. It's convenient. It's not about the environment. It's not about price. It's about convenience. So, new context, solving a problem for consumers. Plug and play, well-defined interfaces, examples, light bulb sockets, 120-volt outlets, USB ports. The great platforms of recent vintage Windows, Internet, the electric grid, the mother of all platforms. So, iPhone and App Store have been disruptive to, as an example, GPS services. Garmin, TomTom, dead. Calculator makers. One of Kristin's colleagues said that he pulled out a calculator recently and his 7-year-old son started laughing at him. Daddy, what's that? He's like, why is it not on your iPhone? Map makers. Camera companies, point and shoot has been killed because most people's point and shoot cameras is on their smartphone now. Stopwatch makers, CD and DVD manufacturers, because you can now get software and music delivered wirelessly. Why do you need these things? Optical drives, all that gone. Video camera companies, most people now are getting their video cameras as on their smartphones. Compass makers, large software companies. If you can buy software for $1.99, why would you spend $400? Phone companies. No, not phone companies. The iPhone, App Store, Android, this has not been disruptive to phone companies. It's been great for phone companies. Second, who else has it been good for? There's two kinds of companies making a lot of record profits in this miserable economy we're in right now. One of them is Apple and Google. The second is the grid operators and mobile phone companies, AT&T, Verizon, Rogers, Orange. Yeah. In other words, the investments they make in the grid are good for their business just like they are for the companies that make the disruptions. So the last thing I'm going to show you is, this is our view. So smart grid is commonly defined as the meter and the distribution management system. That, to us, is the backwater of the consumer-focused smart grid. It's important, but what do consumers care about? All the stuff in their home and how does new value get created out of it. So that tells us, in our view, that the platforms for disruptive growth are two things. Home app stores, and the second is the electric vehicle with in-home charging. So thanks a lot. So we have about 10 minutes, it looks like, 5-10 minutes. Why don't we take questions from the audience first if any of you all have questions? I've got some pre-prepared ones, but does anyone have one they want to jump in with?
It's either a shy group or a hungry group.
Yeah, right. That's don't get between people and lunch, right? So what are you all finding, Kristin, on what type of power demands EVs are creating at different charging rates?
Power demands.
Yes. So rate of power at any given moment, not total electricity usage.
Well, it was mentioned earlier in the panel, what's the equivalent of a plug-in electric vehicle plugging in on, say, 240 volt. And it looks like another house on the local distribution system. So what would that mean? And how might that suggest that, indeed, as clusters evolve, so you've got a neighborhood, say 12 homes are on a single transformer, and that neighborhood is an early adopter neighborhood and might have 5 plug-in electric vehicles. Well, what if they all plug in at the same time? What we're seeing right now, at least with our product, is that 50% of our customers are really happy and very comfortable with plugging in with a common house plug, 120 volt, for overnight charge. That load distribution looks very different than 240. That's the same as a blow dryer. It's 12 amp, continuous, for 8 to 10 hours. But the utilities are like, hey, no problem. We don't even see it. But they do see 240 volt on the system, yanking 15 amp continuous for 3 to 4 hours, and they say, all right, that might be something that we really want to key into because we would love to shift that load. It's not that it's bad load because it's cha-ching for them, they're making money, but they'd really like to shift it. So they have, through these smart systems, and a lot of the smarts are in the vehicle, they have the ability to shift that load to a less efficient part of their portfolio to become more efficient collectively. So that's what we're seeing right now, not only with our product. Now, granted, one thing that I'll point out, the charger is on board the vehicle. Charging stations provide safe, effective electricity to the onboard charger in the vehicle. And all the smarts about power flow are on board the vehicle. The Volt at level 2 will pull 3.3 kW. And the Ford Focus at 240 will pull 6.6 kW. So the utilities are like, okay, and the next product will pull what kW? Because...
And by the way, just for some perspective, a house at peak is pulling about 6.
Right.
So,
right.
So when you add in 6.6, in other words, you've just more than doubled the load of the house at peak.
It could be at peak, heaven forbid, at peak. So the utilities are very keen to watch the migration of the vehicle because of the battery technology and the size of the battery pack itself to make sure, is there a limit here? Should we really suggest, by being an informed stakeholder at the table, that if you get close to 10 kW, that's a serious issue for local distribution. And it's not only, the replacement of a transformer, it's the upgrade of that transformer. And chances are, unless your home is quite new, your service panel and all of the other pipes and wires, so to speak, the conduit suggested to the home has to change. So that's one of the main reasons why when we developed the platform for the Volt, it was suggestive of a journey, as we heard the word earlier today, a learning process for plugging in vehicles that would not burden the system out of the gate. Allow a vehicle that can do extremely well with 120 using a common house plug, and then evolve into the suggestion of what different and newer products might need going forward, and give the utility sector, including the local distribution piece and the transmission piece, a chance to grow with us. Very, very key.
So I've got one question for Eric, but I'll see if there's a question in the audience still. People said still hungry. Okay. Eric, I think a fundamental question that's emerging is what is going to be the kind of the channel to market and kind of the platform owner for all of the consumer-focused systems? Will it be a new class of company, a retail electric provider, a vertically integrated utility? You're seeing this on a global perspective at Silver Spring. What are you seeing as the emerging models and kind of the relative success of these different models?
So I think it's fair to say that if you look around the globe, you'll see every model. So that's good in that we'll get some experience. If we go down to a place like in Australia that looks more like Texas, or even now where Illinois is going, where there's a segmentation between the distribution utility and the retail entities, the experience there has at least tried to say that the retailers will step in and provide that service, and I would say that they haven't. In markets that have had the separation of the distribution company and the retail entity, we have not seen the retailers step up and provide that service. You have some different market models, like in the UK as an example. The UK is a very odd market in that the distribution companies, the normal distribution company, but the meter is owned by the retailer, not by the distribution company. And in part, the notion is that that's going to provide a technical leg up on how we get to and into the home. But you haven't seen it there. So what I would say, we've seen the highest rate of adoption, we just played it by the numbers, would be that the distribution utility creates the enabling infrastructure, and then they, along with the retail outlet market, so literally people going to Best Buy or Home Depot or something to buy their own gizmos, has driven the highest adoption rate to date. I suspect you'll see new market entrants and weird combinations of new market entrants in the future. One group you hear about a lot are security companies.
I agree with you.
Where they come in and they'll say, hey, I'll bundle all this with your whole smart home, and energy will just be a part of it, but it'll be much more comprehensive. And the interesting reason, then we'll let everybody go to lunch, is that when you talk to many, not all, but many retail energy providers, at least at the residential level, they say, well, that'd be really interesting, and I'd love to offer a value-added service and all of that. But my business model is I own generation, and I have customer recruitment in kind of a phone bank somewhere. I don't have any trucks. If somebody called and wanted it fixed, I have no means of going off and doing that. I don't do that as a business today. The guy with the trucks is the distribution company who might say, as an example, well, I don't have an ownership interest in the commodity, so I'm not interested in doing that. And so we're going to have to figure that out, because I think the other piece that's been challenging based on the regulatory environment is the demand responsive part of energy management has value to the generation side, but to the point we're all making here on distribution, poor distribution. So this is the challenge I was trying to allude to of there's a big benefits pool, but the customer gets some money out of it, some value out of it, the utility gets some value out of it, and the retailer might not get any value out of it, because their only value proposition is to sell more energy, right? And so then when we don't get demand responsive infrastructures in a place like in Australia, we go, well, why didn't it happen? We thought it would happen. And it didn't happen because the entity we were counting on to deliver the innovation has no, kind of to the point you were making on your slides, has no interest in driving that innovation forward.
Can I add a comment to demand response? Because it's a really interesting category of kind of managed charging and control. And I mentioned that the smarts for charging are on board the vehicle. Well, a piece of that on board the vehicle is the telematics. Mm-hmm. And indeed, if there is a cluster of vehicles, say parked in a parking ramp or in a neighborhood, and it's at peak, and the utility says, oh, whoa, you know, we're at peak. We don't want to go there. We would really love to have the ability to stop the charging on that cluster of vehicles for, say, 20 minutes, and then start them up again. Folks, it's possible today. Yeah. That's demand response. And the utilities are extremely interested in being able to do that. Rather than give power back to the grid, let's take the power off during those critical times and then start it back up, because the customer could care less as long as their vehicle is charged when they get in it.
Thank you very much.
Oh, that hair. Yeah, clips on.
Yeah, well, you're the only one that had a clip to begin with, Brewster.
Oh,
So don't feel bad about it. Thanks so much for having me.
No, thanks for being part of this,
between the lunch crowd here.